Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here today to learn more about the Asian jumping worm and how to help slow the spread. Going into plant sale season right now, I know I have been especially concerned about us having the Asian jumping worm and not knowing about it and spreading it potentially to other sites. So, I am just going to turn this over now to my colleague, Bob Bruner, who I am so grateful who's here today. He is with our forestry department and is very knowledgeable about our invasives. So Bob, I am going to turn this over to you. I'm going to turn off my video and I'll be watching the chats. I should introduce myself first. My name is Brooke Alford, and I'm an urban ag and natural resource educator here at Purdue Extension in Marion County. I am just hosting this presentation for today. Bob Bruner is our expert, and he will be informing you about this Asian jumping worm and what we need to be doing to slow the spread. It's a very important topic, so I appreciate everybody taking the time today to be here. We are recording, and we will let this link, we will provide a link to this recording when it's ready on our YouTube channel. Maria is here and is our assistant today. Thank you, Maria. So appreciated. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Bob. Bob, thank you for being here. You're on.
All right. Thank you, Brooke. So I am going to offer just a little bit of a correction. So my name is Bob Bruner. I am the exotic forest pest specialist with the Department of Entomology at Purdue University. But I do work a significant amount with our forestry department. I kind of occupy an interesting role where I'm a part of both. Technically, I work with an organization called the Hardwood Timber Improvement and Regeneration Center. I wear a lot of different hats. So what I do is I primarily focus on those exotic or invasive species that interface with urban forestry and residential areas or areas where there are businesses. So I do that portion where humans and the woods meet, and we want to preserve those things. So a lot of the organisms that I work with are typically insects. I am an entomologist. I got my start studying invasive species back when emerald ash borer first arrived here in Indiana some 15 years ago. And today I'm going to apply exactly none of that entomological experience, and I'm going to be talking to you about Asian jumping worm. This is a species or group of species, I should say, that we are more becoming aware of than it being new. We probably had it for a significant amount of time, and only just now are we really becoming conscious of its presence here and what it can do. So a little bit of information on this critter. This is actually a group of critters. So we say Asian jumping worm, but what we're actually referring to is a complex of worm species that are native to Asia, and they're usually made of individuals who are part of two different genuses, so genus Amenthus and genus Metaphyri. And for those of you who aren't aware what that is, it's just how we biologists use nomenclature to define what a species is. For example, humans are Homo sapiens, so our genus is Homo. In this case, for these worms, they are Amenthus and Metaphyri. Now, this is important because it does mean that the way that we identify them isn't ever going to be fully solid. And I've been discovering this more and more over the course of the last year. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about that. Now, some of the things about Asian jumping worms, they are very, very similar to the European worms that we have here in North America, but there are significant differences in their ecology. They also, unlike the European worms that we like to have, will damage the growing environment. They do not offer any benefits. Now, the reason I'm using more emphasis on this is you will find a lot of businesses that will sell you Asian jumping worm under a variety of names, including names like crazy worm, snake worm, Alabama jumpers, and more, where they will say they're great either for bait fishing, which we have a lot of here in Indiana, or they're great for vermiculture. And they'll tell you that lots of scientists say they're invasive, but we believe the benefits outweigh the risks. Folks, these things will decimate soil ecology. There is no benefit to them. They don't even go down deep enough to provide the same benefit that our normal European worms provide. Now, a little bit about those European worms. Whenever I say native in this presentation, I am talking about European earthworms. We have no native worms here in Indiana. You, on occasion, can find them. You need to be an expert in it to be able to identify them. There are very few. All of our worms are European because during glaciation, when glaciers covered what is now Indiana, you'll probably note that half of Indiana is pretty flat. Well, that's because during glaciation, all that topsoil got scraped away by glaciers, effectively killing what native worm species we would have had. And then when we began to colonize North America, we brought them with us in plants or sometimes even intentionally. And we've been enjoying the benefits that they provided us because they filled an environmental niche that was effectively empty. Now, I'm going to be using the European nightcrawler as my example today because that's one that we are all very used to. Every one of us will recognize it. We see them come out during the rain. They're used in fishing. So we know this one very, very well. Now, I'm going to give you a really quick description of what a European nightcrawler does, because in my opinion, one of the most important things we need to have is a baseline. We need to understand how our worms benefit us, the European ones or the native ones, and why the Asian jumping worm is such a problem. Now, if we look at the European nightcrawler, it lives a pretty straightforward life. It feeds on the surface of the soil, consuming leaf litter and plant detritus. And then it will burrow very deeply into the soil, several feet down even. And it will create channels that allow roots to do gas exchange, to do water exchange, and the castings that they create, basically the worm poop, is very, very rich in partially digested organic matter. So they are effectively creating a certain amount of compost as they live, and they're aerating the soil so that our plants can grow more effectively. A little bit more about their biology. The various species of native earthworms, and this is just all of them now, not just nightcrawlers, possess both male and female organs on one individual, so they're hermaphroditic, but they still need a partner to reproduce, so they can't self. Individuals can produce about 20 to 30 cocoons a year, and a cocoon is basically a packet of eggs that contains about 10 eggs per. And these worms, again, depending on species, can live up to 10 years in ideal conditions. Now, this is, excuse me, a little bit reaching because what it is that in very ideal conditions means in a laboratory. In reality, they probably only live more like 2 to 3 years, but that's still a lot of benefit and a lot of work you're getting out of just a single worm. So overall, for our native worm species, we see that they can help put nutrients back into the soil. They can aerate the soil, which will allow our plants to be more effective, and they can survive for a longer period of time, able to reproduce and survive and overwinter undoubtedly. So that way, a single worm can do quite a bit of beneficial work for your garden or whatever growing area you're looking at. So, of course, this now brings us to the question, what is the difference? Why are Asian jumping worms so bad compared to our native worms? Well, I'm going to show you a picture that kind of tells the whole story. Right here, this picture comes from Penn State's Master Gardener program. And what you're looking at right now is a small amount of soil that's been impacted by Asian jumping worm. Take a look at that for a moment and just kind of ask yourself, do you think that's good soil? Because I can tell you it's not. Right now, what we would expect to see with healthy soil is we want good clumping, a good mixture of loam, clays, maybe sands, depending on where you live, with high organic content. That organic content is going to help that soil clump together. It's going to stick to plants really well. This, however, is grainy, and it has generally the consistency of coffee grounds. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about it too as we go. So I mentioned earlier that our European worms tend to burrow deeply into soil, and they go to the surface to feed, or they go to the surface to escape water events because, you know, they've dug these channels, they've aerated the soil. If it rains, the water floods into those channels, so the worms escape it by going to the surface, and we always see them on the sidewalk. However, with Asian jumping worm, they only live in the first few inches of the soil. So they are not digging or burrowing any kind of channels except through the topsoil, the immediate topsoil. And they consume the same plant detritus, wood material, leaf mulch, etc., that the native worms are also going to be consuming. Now, I mentioned that the European earthworms have worm castings that tend to be partially digested, and they provide extra nitrogen, other molecules that are going to be beneficial to plant development. Basically, their poop acts a little bit like compost. It's good for the plants. Asian jumping worms, however, will create castings that are almost entirely devoid of that. They are very efficient at removing nutrients from soil, and they leave behind soil that has a consistency like coffee grounds. And unfortunately, the only plants that are suitable for growing in that are most likely invasive themselves, because invasive plants are kind of built to be able to survive harsh conditions. They're first colonizers, so they're able to survive in the worst areas. If you want an idea of what this looks like in action, this picture kind of really tells the story. You can see that one half of the picture is almost entirely devoid of plant material, any detritus, anything that could decompose and go back into the soil, whereas the second half is actually covered in it. What you're seeing here is essentially the marching line of the worms as they begin to expand outwards. Now, it's important to keep in mind, these worms don't cover the landscape instantly. They're worms. They'll only advance about an inch a year as they consume material in soil. This line right here will help you if you can't see what I'm talking about. On one half of it, you've got coffee grounds. On the other half, you have healthy soil that's going to be usable for plant development. Now, a little bit on their reproduction and their life cycle. You'll note earlier, I talked a little bit about the European earthworm life cycle. 20 to 30 egg cocoons a year, cocoon, able to survive for a couple of years, maybe more. However, we do find there is a significant difference with Asian jumping worm. For example, normally, and I want to emphasize normally here, the adults will only live for a single season. They cannot survive our winters, and they will die after the first hard frost. So the minute you see that first cold snap and the first frost develop, the adult Asian jumping worms are almost completely gone at that point. They will die. They're not very hardy in that regard. The cocoons, the eggs they create, will be laid during the fall, basically right now, and they're going to overwinter in the soil. Now, the hard part too about them is that those egg cocoons are incredibly tiny. They're about the size and they appear in the appearance of a mustard seed. So trying to sift them out is nigh on impossible. I couldn't pay a grad student enough to do that kind of work. Those eggs that they've laid will begin hatching once temperatures begin to get above 50 degrees consistently, and the adults will develop within 60 days. So I'm going to pose a little bit of a question to all of you. I got a report, one that was confirmed this year, that we had adult Asian jumping worm in February. Keep that in mind. The eggs will only hatch when the soil temperatures are consistently above 50 degrees. And we had adults in February. Question I would ask is, where could we be finding them? Now, a lot of you may be scratching your head at that one, because that doesn't sound like it makes sense, right? We were finding them in compost piles that were preserved for the winter, covered in barley. People were doing their exact right procedures and best management practices to help their compost. And we got our first generation completed in February because the worms had infested that compost. So instead of getting just one generation, the adults are born, they only live for a single season and die, we were instead, I would estimate, we've probably gotten anywhere between 3 and 5 generations this year. We've had very high temperatures, very high humidity. Now, we did see the worms drop off during the worst of the drought conditions. But once that ended, they came right back. And I've been getting phone calls and conversations with people ever since then. So let's keep rolling. Now, I mentioned that they're not suited to survive Midwestern winters. However, we can see that the eggs will survive and they will develop very quickly if they're in the right conditions. And while the worms are prolific, they do tend to go through a series of boom and bust cycles, probably because their populations will grow too large. They'll consume all the stuff they want out of soil. And then after they've done that, their population is too large to be supported by their current environment because they're worms, they don't move fast, and they bust. That doesn't mean they're gone, though. It just means the population got knocked down. And I do want to really emphasize here, let's think back to our winter. If we think back to late 2022 and all the way into spring, did we have much of a winter? Because we really didn't. we didn't really get any severe temperatures until almost April when we had a week of significant cold, but it really wasn't that much. So as our climate is continuing to shift, we may be seeing conditions continue to contribute to allowing the worm to get more than one generation a year. Now, when I made this PowerPoint, I used the word two here, 2 generations in a single season. Boy, that did not age well. And I think that we are going to continue to see that trend. Of course, we want to be able to identify them. That's probably the question that's on your mind the greatest right now. How can we tell the difference between these things and the worms that we do want? Now, there are some features we can use. There are a few caveats in here that I'm going to have to describe, but there are definitely some features that will set them apart. One that probably will stand out to a lot of folks is that European worms or native worms tend to remain kind of moist and slimy. Whereas if you see an Asian jumping worm, they almost look scaly. And sometimes you'll even see an iridescence in their skin. And if we look back at that picture here, you can almost see it in the picture on the right. So the right-hand side, we have the Asian jumping worm. Left-hand side, we have our European nightcrawler. Now, I put down here that Asian jumping worms can reach approximately 6 inches in length, which is true. However, I have yet to find where their size differs enough significantly from native worms to be anything probative for identification. So I wouldn't rely on that. One thing you can rely on, however, is that Asian jumping worms are very, very aptly named. They will thrash. They will thrash around as though you were holding a snake that did not want to be held, and they are extraordinarily mobile. So most worms, or all worms, I should say, move by these little tiny hairs we refer to as setae on their body, where they will push them out and use them to move through soil. Most worms only have a few sets of them dotted along an individual segment on their body. Asian jumping worms, however, have a full ring around each segment, meaning they have a lot more capacity to move, which probably also means they burn through more energy when they do so. That's why they're so good at drawing nutrients out of the soil. They need the energy. Another way that we identify them too is that there's the organ known as the clitellum, the organ where their reproductive parts are located, is positioned differently and often appears different as well. So this picture shows you the clitellum on these 2 worms right here. So if we look at our European nightcrawler on the left, the clitellum is slightly raised from the surface of the body. Typically, it's not going to fully wrap around. It's going to be kind of a reddish to like a deep reddish color or brown, and it will stick up a touch. Whereas if we look at the Asian jumping worm, the clitellum in this worm is paler in color. It's a few segments, and it is flush to the body. It will not be raised up at all. Now, unfortunately, I have found a few differences recently. So I mentioned the clitellum is the organ that produces the eggs. I already talked about the European nightcrawler one. And I say here in the Asian jumping worm that it's pale in color compared to the rest of the body. It is flush with the body, and it wraps fully around. All of that is true, except I have been finding instances where that clitellum is not pale. It's a different color. Sometimes it's a different color, but it's kind of hard to tell. I find it's easier to check if it is raised up or it is completely flush. Sometimes you'll find it very, very slightly raised compared to the rest of the body, but not really at all, especially not in comparison to, say, a European nightcrawler or another worm, like a red earthworm or a brown earthworm. I've also been finding that often body color is definitely not anything that will indicate species, so I would not trust the color of the rest of the body. Now, I've already described the CD to you. There is a full ring around each segment on an Asian jumping worm. So for those of you who are good with your microscopes or are familiar with them, you can look at this under a microscope and find them, but I will warn you, it is challenging. And I'm somebody who uses a microscope quite a bit. So you can see often the pores that they will come out of, especially if you've got the light at the right angle. But what I would encourage everybody to do is to please contact Purdue Extension to get your worms identified. Don't try to do it on your own yet. Until we come up with a much better rubric on getting these properly identified, I think that it's going to be best if we let the experts do this one, especially since Asian jumping worms aren't a single species. We're dealing with 3 or 4 different species potentially at once in our state, meaning we're dealing with 3 or 4 different sets of diagnostic features, and we're still sorting out which one is which. Now, this is the one that I'm sure all of you are very interested in. You want to know how to prevent these worms from getting here. Well, you need a few extra facts first before you understand what this is really asking. Asian jumping worms have probably been in the Midwest for decades now. I've seen reports estimated to go back as far as, I think, the first few years of the 20th century, where they were finding Asian jumping worm in greenhouses, I believe. And it has been spread across the United States since then. The thing is that our climate has shifted. And that shift is benefiting those worms. And now we're beginning to see them appear more in other areas, which means their populations are going up and they're spreading more. Now, I'm going to tell you the spots where we typically have the most problems with them, though. So the biggest and most important factor to keep in mind is that we spread them, human beings, our activity. These worms only migrate about an inch a year. They are worms. They cannot fly. They're not going to be running across the ground, anything like that. We move them when we move soil or products that contain soil. This means that they could potentially be moved in potted plants, compost, mulch, or soil from contaminated areas. So if we think about how gardening happens in Indiana, let's say my grandmother, bless her soul, wants to start a new garden. She would call down to her neighbor, the farmer, and ask him for a big old truckload of the black soil that he uses in his field, and he'd drive it over and dump it in the spot where she wanted to develop her garden. That's very, very typical of Indiana and a lot of the Midwest. And that's also a really great way to transport Asian jumping worm. And a lot of us engage in that. Or if we are sharing compost, or if we contribute compost to, say, a community garden. Now, these are all things I'm sure you're thinking about right now. You're probably going through and going, I do several of these things. I trade plants, I trade soil, I want to benefit my neighbors and my community. Here's the thing. Don't panic yet. We are not at the point where every bit of soil is contaminated. We just need to check the soil. Don't use soil that you don't trust. If you are transporting or want to use live plants for something, consider using bare rootstock first before you go to potted plants. And if you're using potted plants, that's only a small amount of soil. It's a controlled environment, so it's easy to check. If you're going to use compost, just follow those best management practices for your compost. Check your compost too. If you've got a ton of worms that are writhing around like crazy, you probably don't want to share that with somebody. You probably want to get rid of it. The other thing you can do too is a lot of this stuff can be solarized. If you wrap up soil completely that you think is contaminated and leave it out in the sun until it reaches 105 degrees Fahrenheit internally, that will kill the worms and their eggs. So there is an option for you to get rid of them right out the gate without spending any money. And then you want to avoid using or transporting soil from your property. Treat it like how you keep hearing us talk about firewood. You've probably seen bumper stickers for the last 15 years that say, don't move the firewood. Well, in this case, this is applying to soil where we're just going to be cautious and not transport soil that we don't trust. I would prefer if we stopped sharing soil until we have a full handle on where this worm is and where it's going to go. But until we get there, we just need to err on the side of caution. Now, that being said, almost every single instance of Asian jumping worm that I have had reported to me has come either from a landscaping feature or from compost. And I'm guessing those are the biggest problem areas at the moment. That is me speculating, though. I don't have a scientific study to guarantee that. So we're still learning here. We are still gathering information. Unfortunately, some of these locations have been community gardens too. So you can imagine that you have potential for spread here. But if you're following your best management practices, i.e. cleaning tools, checking things that are coming in for contamination, just like you would if you had fungal issues or any number of other issues. If you're trying to manage insects, these are similar things that you're already going to be doing. Now, one of the things that we've also noted with problem areas is that the compost, again, almost every single compost pile that I've had reported to me had been preserved over the winter using straw or barley as insulation to keep the compost going throughout the winter. So those processes still run. Well, the worms are able to survive in those, and that's how they've been coming out earlier and earlier. Now, a little more on detection, because I am still getting emails this week. I got one even this morning about people asking, is this Asian jumping worm and how do I know? So there are a few easier things that you can start out with. For one, the soil. That coffee ground appearance is obvious. And I got a picture in my inbox this morning of someone asking me, this looks a lot like Asian jumping worm presence. And boy, did it ever. It just coffee ground consistency soil. You can check for the worms near the surface. They don't dive deep. They will definitely not go more than 8 inches down. And I'd be surprised, honestly, if they got to the 8-inch mark. They want to stay close to the surface and they stay mobile. So if you start sampling your soil, digging out in various spots and just going through and sifting out what's present, you'll be able to find worms, whether they're Asian jumping worms or not. The last one here is the mustard test. Now, I do want to dispel something I heard earlier this week. Someone had asked me if this is a fix for Asian jumping worm. There are no chemical methods available to us in Indiana to eliminate Asian jumping worm. The best we can do is detect them and physically remove them. Now, the mustard test is one of those detection methods. You can mix about 1/3 cup of ground hot mustard seed into a gallon of water and then slowly pour half of that over a 1 square foot area. What's going to happen is it's going to be repellent to the worms, so it's not going to harm anything. And they'll just force all the worms to the surface. Now, keep in mind, this is forcing all of the worms to the surface, whether they're Asian jumping worms or not. But since Asian jumping worm is within the first few inches of soil, if they're present, they're going to be the first thing you see. That is a detection method. Now, as for eradication, Asian jumping worm is for sale in a variety of stores that are fully capable of legally selling within the state of Indiana. We have no existing regulations to manage them. This is one of those points where you can contact your legislators, your representatives, and talk to them about this problem and encourage them to get this worm regulated. Because unfortunately, DNR, the regulatory arm of Indiana's management of its wildlife, they can't do anything about this. The best thing we can do is encourage our representatives to look at this closer. Until then, we don't have chemical treatment options. The EPA has not approved any chemical to treat for Asian jumping worm, and I have seen a lot of people claiming to sell fertilizers and other things that are supposedly effective against Asian jumping worm. But folks, I have yet to see a single one do anything, and it sounds like a lot of snake oil to me. Right now, the best way to get rid of them is to physically remove them, hand-pick them out, dispose of them in a trash bag, or solarize them in the way that I described earlier. You could take that compost, you could take that mulch, you could take that topsoil that you just bought, spread it out in your driveway, completely wrap it up, and let it cook. And this summer has been a great time to cook because it has been burning hot. Those worms cannot survive those high temperatures like that. The trouble is that is a decent amount of manual labor. I would not recommend anybody do this by themselves, regardless of your age, because that's a lot of soil you may be going through. And the good thing is, too, by the way, the solarization, it has been shown, it will kill the eggs as well. The eggs will not survive that. Now, the hard part. This is one of the ones that I have yet to figure out a good way of managing this. When it comes to sales, exchanges, and community gardens, how do we manage this? What I would say first is don't share plants if you don't know the person, because you need to check soil for contamination and you can't be sure that there isn't worms in there. Use trusted sources. Help each other monitor. Closely monitor any plants that are coming into a community garden, especially any compost or soil. I would honestly begin closing off and keeping sterile sites within a community garden so that way you can handle that as opposed to bringing stuff in. You can exchange plants from a non-sterile source. So let's say you have a contaminated source and somebody brought in their tomatoes at the beginning of the season, they're wanting to get them planted in. The plants themselves are not infested. They don't want the plants. They want the stuff that the plants leave behind. They want the plant detritus. They want the leaves that fall off. They want the old rotting wood bits. You can clean off the plants and clean off the roots and put them in a sterile planting medium and still be okay. You'll reduce your chances significantly. And the other thing is what you're doing right now. Educate yourself. learn to identify them, and please, please report them. That is one of the biggest challenges that I am running into right now, is that I can't tell you where these are at in Indiana yet. You probably saw an Indy Star article that came out earlier this week that showed several counties. However, I think we accidentally left a county off of there because I believe Vigo County also has a confirmed presence. But the trouble is, it's probably in several more areas in Indiana. It's just people aren't reporting them. And if they don't report, I only have so much time to be able to drive out and check myself. So please report them, get them confirmed with us, send them to the Plant and Pest Diagnostic Laboratory, and get them confirmed, but then make sure they're reported too. Now then, one last thing on the issue of reporting. Oh, I see a good question there in the chat. I wanted to address it before I move on. So someone is asking right now, what do you think about using saponins, alfalfa pellets, or TC to combat Asian jumping worm? This is one of the biggest ones that I see people suggest. And honestly, I have found no evidence that indicates that saponins are effective at control of Asian jumping worm. Now, there is more research that needs to be done, but right now, until I see that research, I'm going to have to say that there's no evidence that it's going to help you at all. In fact, if someone's trying to push that on you, I would be a little bit concerned of whether you're getting a product that's going to be worth your time and money. So there's my opinion on that. Now, as for reporting them, so my predecessor and mentor, Dr. Cliff Sadoff, set up this website called the Purdue Plant Doctor. So what he did was he created this website where you could type in basically something like earthworm or spotted lanternfly or a plant name, and it would lead you to information about anything you could possibly be looking for. And what I'm doing right now is I'm quite literally working on getting Asian jumping worm entered into this system along with several other things that you can use. And if you put in something that is invasive, you will find a button that says report, and it will help you get that done. So let's say if you search for spotted lanternfly, a very nasty invasive bug, right, that's in Indiana right now, and you search for it and you know it's right by you, you'll see on its webpage there's a button for reporting it, and you could go ahead and do that. And I'm going to have that set up here in the next few days so you can access that feature and use it on this site. You can't report them to DNR and expect anything because unfortunately DNR can't regulate them. They can't do anything. Really, they're just kind of sending information back to us so that way we can build a database of where we know, so that way we know where they are, and you can use that information to advocate for getting these worms regulated. And then let's see, the last thing I'm going to cover right now is when it comes to reporting them, if you don't use the Purdue Plant Doctor first, is that you can also report them using edmaps.org, and I'm sure Brooke would be more than happy to help you figure that out. You can also contact me and I will, or use glidden.org. I would go to edmaps first myself. That one will help you enter them into a distribution map, so that way we know where they are. You can also call 1-866-NO-EXOTIC for reporting any invasive species, including Asian jumping worm. Now that will probably connect you to DNR, but it will come back to me eventually, and I'll be able to put it into the database that we're maintaining at Purdue. And of course, you can always email me. I would honestly kind of prefer you just email me about it until we get these regulated, because I'm ultimately going to be the one who's working on this. And then just a few invasive species information bits here. We do have social media available. And I already talked to you about the 1-866-NO-EXOTIC number. I would rather you go ahead and report an invasive, even if you're wrong, so that way we could still check it out because you may have found something. And all of these resources are available to you to be able to look at and talk about these insects, worms, and whatever. All right, so that is what I have for the presentation. So why don't we go through some of the questions, because I see a few more have come up too. So I see someone is asking, I started doing the mustard test on my yard, negative for Asian jumping worm, but I realized that it's endless. If I test 5 spots, they could be in other adjacent areas I haven't tested. Am I being overly negative? So I think you might be a little too negative on that one. So what you're doing right there is a little bit of statistical sampling, just like scientists do. If you tested 5 spots and you're not finding Asian jumping worm, you're probably in the clear. What I would do is you can tailor that to combine your testing with areas that look questionable. But if you've already got 5 spots done and you're doing a good random sampling, I mean, I think you're probably in the clear there. Just keep doing it, keep monitoring. Don't panic until you find something. Let's see, how best to clean tools, what to do with soil when worms are removed, and how can you solarize them, clear or black plastic. So first off, cleaning tools. We have a lot of resources that I'm sure Brooke is willing to share with you on potentially how to clean your tools. For me, when I'm doing work with areas that I am not sure about, I clean my tools in about let me think, I think it's a 30% bleach solution, bleach and water, and that should be effective. These aren't like pathogens. They're not going to be that resistant to things. So even just a little bit of sterilizing will work pretty well. How hot a day do you need to solarize them? That one, I'm not sure I could tell you, but I'm very confident that a day that is 80 degrees or above, leaving out soil in either clear or black plastic is going to solarize it pretty effectively. Normally, I see sources recommend solarizing them in clear plastic, but the black should also be absorbing all the energy from the sun as well, and it should technically get hotter. So I think either one should work, but again, that's me speculating. What about reporting if we aren't in Indiana? Is there a national spot? Holly, I do not know. What I would do is I would contact your state's extension service or equivalent of to be able to see if they have reporting open. Unfortunately, I don't know how other states are tackling this problem right now or if they have a problem, because not all of them do. I can tell you it has been confirmed, at least in our kind of north central area of Indiana, where Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Ohio. But beyond that, I'm not sure I could tell you on that. Let's see, what is the risk of using commercial compost in plastic bags? I would personally, I would solarize it just in case. I generally treat businesses with a little bit of a grain of salt, and I would just go ahead and solarize it because getting soil temperature to reach 105 degrees Fahrenheit on a good hot day is not hard. And you could just go ahead and solarize it in the bag it came in. See, I'm checking to see if I missed a question there. I think not. What is the amount of hot mustard seed to the 1 gallon of water? Where do I find hot mustard seed? Is it like spice section at the grocery? The easiest way that I do it is if you go to an Asian grocery, they'll usually have ground hot mustard seed, and you should be able to find it in a few different just regular stores as well. And it would be in the spice section, yes. And then I think, let's go back to that slide here where I describe it, because I think I said 1/3 of a cup of ground hot mustard seed in a gallon of water. So that gives you that idea. If you have doubts about the worm ID, should we email a photo to you? Yes, absolutely. Even if you don't doubt your worm ID, go ahead and email it to me. Now, one thing I will say is that if you email pictures of like soil that looks damaged or Asian jumping worm suspects, I would like to use them for educational reasons as well. So just let me know if you're okay with that when you email them to me. And I would love it if you guys emailed me those pictures as much as you can. See, my garden club always has a plant sale with plants from members' gardens. We wash off the roots of each plant and pot it in fresh pot planting medium. Could we continue with our plant sale even if some people have jumping worm? If you're doing that, yeah, you should be just fine. If you're washing off roots and putting it into fresh planting medium, you are like, there's not going to be a bulletproof way of keeping the worms away, but you're doing exactly what I was recommending. So I think you should be in the clear there. The biggest issues that I personally see coming from plant exchanges or sales is if we maybe hand wave a little bit of some of the newer folks or folks we don't know as well bringing in soil. Like they may not have the knowledge you do. You don't know who's been doing the best practices. But if you are going through and you are doing the effort of you're already washing off the plants and you're repotting them, then I think that you are doing exactly what you should be. All right. I do not see any more questions. I do see Brooke added a link for cleaning reusables, which is a very good link. She added a link for edmaps.org as well.
I have a question for you, Bob. I should be more familiar with EdMaps than I am. Going to their website, I see an affiliation with the University of Georgia. Is EdMaps a national tool or is it regional?
It's effectively national. So
Oh,
it was created by the University of Georgia here. I'm going to stop sharing for just a moment here so everybody can see EdMaps. I'll just bring it up on my
great, thank you.
web browser real quick. So EdMaps is a great tool because it allows us to go ahead and map out and track a lot of these invasive species. So it's not just going to be Asian jumping worm that you see on it. You're going to see other things. If it will go ahead and load for me, that'd be nice. But what it's intended to do is it's intended to allow you to go ahead and report and find reports of the different critters that you don't want or the different serious invasives that we're dealing with. So right now I'm going to their distribution maps, and you can see here it brings up all this information about different creatures, etc. I'm going to go ahead and type in jumping worm. You can see it brings up several things here, jumping worm, different families, and I'm going to the one called Amenthus right here. So this is the primary genus that we are concerned about, and it should bring up a map of distributions of Amenthus species. So you can see it's got a map of the United States right in front of me right now, and I'm going to go ahead and zoom in a little bit on Indiana. So you'll notice there that people have been reporting, which I absolutely adore. I'm so happy people are reporting this one. And you'll see that the bulk of the reports are currently coming out of Bloomington. And yes, Bloomington has had a significant number of reports of that I've gotten calls from landscapers, gardeners, etc. You can see that there are 4 reports coming out of Indianapolis right now. We zoom in a little closer, it will go ahead and divvy up those locations. That's actually kind of interesting information too, because as someone who's an ecologist and works with invasive species, that gives me an idea of potential areas of spread depending on what's going on there. And then if I just pop back out, let's take a closer look at Bloomington here, where we've gotten so many reports. And you can see that they're spread through different neighborhoods. And essentially what I would guess is probably people are buying and exchanging plants and that kind of thing. But this gives you an idea of what EdMaps does. Now, if you want to report a sighting, you can go to that tab that I just clicked on there. It'll make you make an account. I'm not going to go through the whole steps of mine, but once you make an account, it'll lead you through the steps necessary to report, to describe your location, where you found it, and maybe add pictures and things too. So here, I will go ahead and stop sharing that now. All right, so do we have any other questions?
Thank you so much, Bob. Susan asked, when we buy plants from reputable nurseries, should we remove the soil they come in?
That's a really good question. I wish I could tell you yes or no to that one. Now, myself, I err on the side of caution. I would do it anyways. However, it may be the step too far. I don't want you to have a distrust of nurseries, reputable or not. But I do want you to be conscious. Use your best judgment. If you get a potted plant from a nursery and you look in the pot and the soil looks bad, it looks like coffee grounds, then you probably should change that soil out. But if you get one and it just looks like topsoil, then you're probably in the clear.
Thank you so much, Bob. I will say, Susan, I have started, but I have a long way to go, calling our bulk suppliers of soil and compost around Indianapolis. The first one I called, and I don't want to say names because I don't blame anybody for this, but the first one I called, I talked to their CEO and they didn't know what the Asian jumping worm was. So it's my impression that retailers are not taking steps to slow the spread. And it's also my impression that they need to hear from us. As Bob said, advocating with your elected officials is extremely important. So is talking to your retailers. If they aren't familiar with the Asian jumping worm, they need to be familiar. Ask them, what are you doing to slow the spread? Can I trust your product? What are you doing to make your product safe for my use in my garden? Does that make sense to you, Bob?
It does. Folks, there's a lot of using your best judgment involved with this one. Until we get a better understanding of how these organisms are going to spread and what they're going to do, we're just going to have to be a little bit cautious and kind of think through how we do things. Mm-hmm. Now, I do see that there's an additional question that's actually a really interesting one too. Are there any plants that seem to repel these worms? Now, I have not found that information yet, but that is a piece of information I'm very eager to find. It, theoretically, any plant that has a secondary compound that it would exude into the soil to repel herbivores could impact Asian jumping worm. Now, I don't have good enough information to say if that will happen yet. These are very, very resilient organisms. They eat very, very quickly. So there's some research to be done there, but it'd be interesting to find out if something like parsnip or even like garlic mustard repelled them. But I wouldn't want to encourage anybody to like plant garlic mustard or something like that.
With that said, would you think that, for instance, a black walnut might repel them in the vicinity of its roots?
That one we don't know yet,
Okay.
but one of the things that I watch for is how compacted is the soil versus compared to different trees. If the soil is very compacted, then Asian jumping worms probably not going to be very present because they'd rather go for the easier food. They're going to go for soil that's loose and loamy and has lots of plant material. Now, if there were going to be a plant that would repel them, black walnut would be one that I would definitely take into consideration because the juglone, I can't remember the chemical name properly, you have to pardon me, should be repellent to a lot of things. But that hopefully I'll get time to actually research that because I would love to find out.
Thank you. Thank you. Mickey asks a really good question. She would like to know of a good reference sheet for community gardeners and Spanish speakers. Do you know if there is one available, Bob? And Mickey, that's a great question. And if there's not, we will try to make it available. Bob, do you know?
So there is a Purdue Landscape Report piece that I wrote on Asian jumping worm that you can find in the Purdue Landscape Report from earlier this year. And I'm going to continue to try to put out more of them as I can. Unfortunately, my Spanish is not adept enough for me to be able to write one into Spanish myself. So hopefully I will be able to ask our communications department to help me out with that to get something out there. I may also ask Dr. Sadoff, who does a lot of that translation work with other invasives, if he'd be willing to lend a hand. So hopefully we'll get it out there eventually.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question, Mickey. And I just put a link in the chat to that Purdue Extension report, landscape report. So take a look at that. And Bob, we can talk more offline about translations. I know that the Indiana Native Plant Society is also very interested in translating important materials, so we might reach out to them as well.
Mm-hmm. And then the last question I see on there, how much research is being done on this nationally? I couldn't begin to tell you. It really varies by state because some states have it significantly worse than we do, and other ones barely see them at all or recognize them as a problem. So that hopefully there will be more. I'm genuinely hoping we can get some at Purdue even, but we just don't have a good answer to that yet.
Yeah. And Tom, I do know that in Wisconsin, from what I read, they were detected in 2013. And a colleague has told me that in Madison, Wisconsin, there's a moratorium on plant sales right now. I'm not sure who's implemented that moratorium. If that's, a legal entity, a nonprofit, or extension. Bob, do you know that by any chance?
If there's a moratorium on plant sales, it would either have to be amongst organizations or it would have to be something done by a municipality. Okay. But unfortunately, I just don't know what the situation is there.
Okay. I know that the Indiana Native Plant Society, and I will fess up, I am a member, and I was at a council meeting with them recently, and that was discussed. Do we need to put a moratorium on our plant sales? And they decided no, that it's too important of a tool to get native plant material out there, to contribute to ecological diversity and that sort of thing. So what they chose to do is just to require people to implement best practices when donating plants to their sale, and that includes bare rooting your plants before you plant them into sterile medium. And we can send out that document to participants of this webinar. Barb is on the channel here, and I can ask her if she can send that document out for folks to read. Does that make sense to you, Bob?
Yep, that makes perfect sense. And I will continue to try to get more publications available as time goes on. Just keep in mind, my son recently came into my life. He was born about 2 months early and he is blessedly healthy, but I'm a very new father and still getting used to that. So I'm a little behind on everything.
And Bob, we are so happy for you and proud and so glad that your son is doing well. And hope you are getting plenty of time to spend with him. We're just so happy for you. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you
Well,
for taking the time to be here today, most of
yeah,
all.
I love talking to groups about this. I'm hoping that we can get more information as soon as we can to everyone. And again, please feel free to email me questions. I'm happy to try to help as I can.
Okay. And I will attest to that. Bob is a great resource. So please keep him in mind with all of your questions about this horrible new invasives. I wish that we were coming with better news, talking about something fun like landscape design, but here today we just need to get this education out. So thank you so much, Bob. Really appreciate it.
Yep, no problem.
Any more questions before we break up today? Thank you so much for everybody for attending, taking time out of your Friday afternoon to be with us and to educate yourself. Please continue to spread the word for us, and we will share resources with those who registered for attendance today. Hi, Mickey. I think Mickey's coming to us from Tippecanoe County, right, Mickey? Thank you for being
That's
here.
correct.
Okay,
Out in the garden.
great. Everybody have a wonderful weekend. Thank you again.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.